Benoit was once a hero to many kids. Grown men loved him, and women looked at him as the ultimate physique. If you ever saw Chris wrestling live, then you remember this moment, Chris giving his famous finishing move, either from the ground or jumping off the top rope, to where all you could see when he leaps off is nothing but cameras flashing, and when he lands on his opponent, the crowd screams and roars. That was the Chris Benoit we knew, but not what he ended as. Some things in life just can't be answered simply having a yes or a no. The last days, the last hours of Chris's life are mixed with much emotion. Many people still look at Chris as the best, but disturbed by what Chris has done. At one point in time in history, Chris was a beloved husband, a beloved father, and thought of as the ultimate family man. But somewhere something got messed up. This is the moment Chris Benoit murdered his family and took his own life. To the public, Chris was a huge superstar that could do no wrong, but the interminglings of Chris's life, from his marriage to his personal life, personal health, emotions, and work schedule, continued to roll down a hill, catching everything on fire in his own life. Over the decades from Chris's passing, many secrets have come out, things that took time to come out, to show themselves. We now know about many hidden secrets that might shed light on what happened that one day. Chris lived in Georgia with his family. He was still actively wrestling, working out multiple times a day, and traveling non-stop, trying to maintain the family, and recently, at the end of his life, was tossed into extreme grief from the loss of his best friend, Eddie Guerrero, who had another life himself that was tragically cut short from heart failure. Chris took the loss of Eddie, as some might say, how one loses a soulmate. Chris was devastated. He never seemed to fully recover from it, but Chris takes no time off. He's still wrapped up in big storylines, wrestling, that he can't just walk away from. His career is booming, bigger than it's ever been. He's also in the early stages of starting his own wrestling school in Atlanta. Chris did what he always did. He kept himself busy and worked more and more. Chris was known to take heavy hits to the head inside the ring. One of his main moves, jumping off the top of the rope, was executed by Chris, landing his skull on his opponent. Huge falls from big heights, his brain being tossed around and damaged. And also, we know that Chris was abusing steroids, making his body into something unnatural. To many, Chris was a family man. His peers and other men that looked up to him, and his colleagues in the circle of wrestling, knew Chris as a friend, someone they went to for advice about wrestling, management, fatherhood. It's said by many people that Chris was a pillar in a lot of wrestlers' lives. Nancy, Chris's wife, before the end, would confront Chris about his steroid use. It's now known that Chris would have horrendous mood swings from steroids, bringing hardship to his marriage. Nancy would confront Chris, telling him to seek help, find a counselor, anything he could, to reach out for help, to control something that was out of control in his own life. Just days before Chris's horrendous crime, he was talking with friends and family about the 4th of July, making future plans together, some time off, everyone coming together, watching their children play and celebrate. Chris was excited and talking about fireworks and cooking out. The last week of Chris's life somewhat goes dark with information. What we do know is that Chris started messaging some friends with weird text messages of life, death, religion, the trend that we see from a lot of people that do take their own life, the pre-stages that are set up before someone harms themselves, a silent cry out. What little we do know about the murders would unfold like this. They would start on Friday, June 22nd of 2007. Somewhere in the day, somewhere in the night, more than likely late that Friday, Nancy or Chris, or both of them, would put Daniel to bed. After that, Nancy and Chris would end up in their office, where Chris would murder Nancy. Chris would take her and pin her down on the floor, face down, pressing her body into the floor with his knee while strangling her with a cord. It was a violent and vicious murder. Her limbs from her hands to her feet were tied together, then placed in a towel, and when she was found, a little blood was found under her head, but there were no signs of defense wounds or fighting. Nancy could do nothing to protect herself. When Chris leaves her body, he leaves a Bible right next to her. Chavo Guerrero is believed to be one of the last people to talk to Chris and hear his voice. Chris and Chavo would make contact on the 23rd, that Saturday. Chris is telling Chavo that he has a situation, that Nancy and Daniel have food poisoning, and that he's not going to make it to the event that night in Texas, but he's also trying to rework his flights for the next night, where they have a pay-per-view event. Chris and Chavo text and talk on the phone for the following hour back and forth, but the last time they do talk to each other that day, before Chris hangs up, he tells Chavo, in a deep breath, "I want you to know that I love you." Chavo really thinks nothing of it, although it is odd for Chris, and he can tell that he sounds a little upset and out of the ordinary. But Chavo himself is busy catching planes and getting ready for a match himself that night. From this point of the story, what is going on inside the house goes even darker with information and what's about to happen next. Daniel, the youngest son of Chris's, who was home with Chris and Nancy, his part in the story is still very unknown. Daniel was murdered somewhere Saturday to Sunday. It's not even clear if Daniel awoke Saturday morning, but when the house is found, it appears that a child had been up, playing on the couch and watching cartoons. We do know Daniel was sedated. He would end up in his bed, in his room, and suffocated to death. For some reason, a large butcher knife was found under Daniel's bed that was never used. And also, next to Daniel, is another Bible as well. Chris Benoit has now murdered his wife and his young child. Somewhere in that Saturday, maybe even Sunday, Chris will complete the final act of his plan. He goes down to his gym in his house, more than likely already pre-planned of how he was going to take his life. He goes to his weight machine, placing huge weights on it, right on the cord to hold strong tension. And from there, Chris allows the machine to strangle him to death. And that's how Chris Benoit would take his life. No hints, no nothing of why and what happened in detail. Still today, though, over a decade later, there's really no answers, and people just want to say that Chris was an evil, evil person. As Chris would miss his pay-per-view event that took place over the weekend, everyone is immediately in panic that there's no show, no call, nothing from Chris. Eventually, Chavo and a few other friends would tell the company that Chris had messaged them the same messages on Sunday night around 4 o'clock in the morning. Chris would just say the same thing to everyone. The dogs are outside and the side door of the garage is unlocked. When McMahon himself finds out these were the messages that Chris sent, he immediately panics and sends police to the Benoit residence to see if something was wrong. The police arrive on Monday. They're met by a neighbor that would oddly enough go in the house first. She would run out of the house screaming, saying that Daniel and Nancy were both dead. Police immediately storm the residence, and from there it's a crime scene. Around 5 o'clock that day, the world is notified of what's going on at the Benoit residence. The only clue that was found was in a Bible where Chris had handwritten a sentence saying this: "I'm preparing to leave this earth." No time or date of when he wrote it. When the autopsy is done, Chris was found to have massive brain damage. The doctor performing the autopsy said that Chris's brain looked like the brain of an 85-year-old, and along with Chris's abuse of steroids, all of this contributes to a motive of perhaps what happened, why it happened, but still left with no answer of why it did happen. What we do know at one point in time is that Chris loved his family, always putting them first, and was the ultimate dad. He was a good man, but anybody that knew Chris knew this wasn't him that weekend. Something snapped in his brain. There's no signs that any of it were premeditated, that Chris had planned to murder his family. It simply just looks like Chris snapped. Many wrestling fans and critics will argue that Chris should or should not be erased from the history books of wrestling. Either way we cut it, what happened that weekend at the Benoit residence was a dark tragedy, A mother lost her life, and a young child lost his life by the one person that they trusted and looked at as their hero, Benoit, the father who lost himself.